It was a moment that changed everything. A wedding. A celebration. But for Betty Broderick, this wasn't the day of love. It was the day of betrayal. A day that would drive her to the unthinkable. A day that would end in bloodshed. And the shocking twist, it wasn't just the husband she was seeking revenge on, but the woman who had replaced her in the life she'd fought so hard to build. Imagine Betty Broderick, a mother of 4, a woman once admired in her community, standing in the middle of her life, shattered by a storm she couldn't control. By the late 1980s, Betty's life had taken a dramatic turn from the seemingly perfect suburban dream to a nightmare. It wasn't just that her marriage to Dan Broderick, once the love of her life, had fallen apart. It was the way he had completely abandoned her. Betty had once been a devoted wife. She had given up her own dreams to support Dan's career, from medical school to law school, from law clerk to successful medical malpractice lawyer. Betty had been by Dan's side through it all. She had put her own career ambitions on hold to raise their 4 children, Kim, Lee, Daniel, and Rhett. To Betty, her life was about family. Everything she had was for them. But as time went on, Dan began to change. His success brought not just wealth, but new temptations. Dan Broderick, a man who was once just a struggling student alongside Betty, was now a wealthy, powerful lawyer, respected in their community. But wealth and success came at a price, and Dan began to find his old life with Betty increasingly restrictive. He no longer saw her as his equal, but as a shadow of the woman who had married years ago seemed distant now. Instead, he began to look for someone else. That's where Linda Cole-Keener came into the picture. Linda, a stunningly beautiful, fresh-faced 21-year-old legal assistant, had all the qualities that Betty felt she had lost over the years: youth, beauty, and an unburdened life. The affair between Dan and Linda started innocently enough, but it quickly became a very public, very painful betrayal. Betty, who had supported Dan in every way, was devastated. She had already felt invisible in their marriage, and now she was being replaced by someone younger and more attractive. The emotional impact of the affair was unbearable. Dan didn't even try to hide it, and the press and public couldn't get enough of the scandal. And then came the ultimate betrayal. Betty had always been a woman of fierce devotion and strong opinions. The years of silence, of pretending everything was fine while Dan spent his time with Linda, slowly eroded her mental health. The pain of knowing that her marriage was falling apart in such a public way, while Dan went on with his life, living with Linda in their beautiful new home, was unbearable. But it wasn't just the affair that hurt Betty. It was the way Dan had manipulated her, treated her as if she were invisible, disregarded the years of sacrifice she had made for their family. It wasn't just emotional pain. Betty's entire world was being ripped apart. The divorce was messy, and Dan, the lawyer, played the legal game with a vengeance. He not only won full custody of their children, but also succeeded in gaining control of the assets that Betty had helped build. Dan had become the man she once admired, but now he had become the enemy. Betty felt isolated. She no longer had a place in the life she'd spent decades creating. Dan had replaced her, and Betty's frustration and anger consumed her. But there was a point when all of that pain turned to rage. Betty wasn't just a woman scorned. She was a woman betrayed, a woman left to pick up the pieces of a shattered life. And the longer the divorce dragged on, the more hopeless it seemed. Betty felt as if the world was against her. And that's when the idea of revenge took root. In the months leading up to November 5th, 1989, Betty's emotions were boiling over. She couldn't bear to see Dan and Linda, newly married, living the life she had once thought would be hers. The children, her beloved children, were caught in the crossfire of a bitter custody battle. The world seemed to have turned its back on Betty, leaving her angry and heartbroken. It was a dangerous combination. Betty's obsession with her former husband and his new wife began to consume her. Every detail of their life, every action, every word spoken in the courtroom, it all felt like a personal attack. And in the midst of it all, Betty's mental health deteriorated. The public, meanwhile, watched in disbelief as the divorce and custody battle dragged on. Betty, once a respected member of their community, became a figure of sympathy and ridicule. It was clear Betty Broderick was a woman undone by betrayal, a woman who felt the weight of the world upon her shoulders, but no one could predict what would happen next. Betty Broderick was about to make a decision that would shock the world. The crime was not a spontaneous act of rage. It was years in the making. Betty had suffered, but what happened next would forever change the course of her life. Betty Broderick entered the home of Dan and Linda Broderick that fateful night with a gun in her purse. The couple had just finished hosting a dinner with friends. They were still in their home, blissfully unaware that Betty was about to change everything. Betty, driven by a volatile mix of anger, betrayal, and hopelessness, shot Dan and Linda multiple times in cold blood. The story would make headlines. A woman scorned, a violent act of revenge. It was a tragedy that shook the nation. But what came next was even more shocking. The trial. Betty Broderick would go from being a wife and mother to being the most infamous figure in a story about betrayal, loss, and the devastating consequences of a broken marriage. But was she a cold-blooded murderer, or a woman who had been driven to the edge of insanity by years of abuse and heartbreak? Betty's story was just beginning, and the world would soon be forced to reckon with the question: could someone truly be pushed to the brink of murder by the weight of emotional and psychological betrayal? This case would become a symbol, not only of personal tragedy, but also of how far a person could be pushed before they broke. The shot rang out like a thunderclap, deafening in its finality. But even as the sound echoed through the walls of Dan and Linda Broderick's lavish home, it was not just the victim's blood that would spill. It was Betty's life as well, a life that was no longer hers. From that moment on, the world would never be the same for Betty Broderick. Betty Broderick's crime wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. It was a culmination of years of emotional suffering, shattered dreams, and an overwhelming sense of abandonment. As the gunshots reverberated in the night, the entire community would soon be plunged into shock. The headlines read, "Woman murders ex-husband and his new wife." But the story, as it would unfold in courtrooms and on national news, would be much more complicated than simple headlines suggested. How could it have come to this? That was the question on everyone's mind. The crime was unthinkable. Betty Broderick, the once beloved wife and mother, had killed her ex-husband, Dan, and his new wife, Linda. But to truly understand the horror of that night, we have to look closer at what led Betty to this unthinkable act. Was she a woman who had been pushed to the brink of no return? In the aftermath of the murders, the scene at the Broderick home was a horrific display of violence. Dan and Linda had been sitting at their dining table when Betty entered, her presence unannounced and ominous. It was late at night, a peaceful evening, interrupted by a sudden and brutal act. Betty, with her .38 caliber handgun, shot Dan twice in the chest and Linda once in the head. Their bodies lay in a pool of blood, the violent culmination of Betty's years of frustration and broken dreams. What followed next shocked the world, but perhaps even more shocking was the way Betty would be portrayed. Was she a cold-blooded killer, or a woman desperate for justice in a world that had forgotten her? Betty didn't try to escape. Instead, she calmly drove to her parents' house, where she would later tell them what had happened. She confessed to the murders, but there was no remorse in her voice. She was, at that point, numb. The years of betrayal, humiliation, and emotional torment had consumed her. The woman who had once been known for her charm and warmth was now a cold, broken version of herself. Her parents were horrified, but Betty's anger seemed justified to her. She was the victim, she thought. She had been abandoned by her husband, left with nothing but her children and the wreckage of a life that she had given everything to build. Betty's actions seemed almost inevitable in the twisted emotional logic that had taken hold of her. She wasn't just seeking revenge. She was trying to take back control of her own narrative, a narrative that had been hijacked by Dan's betrayal. But as Betty made her confession, the question remained, why had she murdered Linda? It wasn't just Dan who had taken something from her. It was the woman who had come into her life, taken her place, and lived the life Betty had once thought was hers. Linda was the ultimate symbol of Betty's downfall. To Betty, she wasn't just a lover. She was the physical manifestation of all the years she had sacrificed for Dan, only to see him walk away and replace her with someone younger and more desirable. Betty Broderick wasn't just killing her ex-husband that night. She was killing the version of herself that had once loved him, the woman who had been betrayed, forgotten, and replaced. The police investigation began almost immediately after Betty's confession. What followed was a careful reconstruction of the events of that night, piecing together every detail. Betty, in her own words, described the evening in chilling detail. She had planned to confront Dan and Linda, but she hadn't planned on taking their lives. But in the heat of the moment, with rage consuming her, Betty made a choice that would defy her life from that point forward. But here's where the story takes an unexpected turn. Betty didn't just accept her fate. She fought back against the label of cold-blooded killer with a vengeance. Her defense in court would be one of the most talked-about aspects of the trial. Betty's attorneys argued that she was a victim, victimized by years of emotional abuse, betrayal, and neglect. They claimed she had snapped under the pressure, driven to the edge by the trauma of watching her entire world collapse. The public's reaction was divided. Some saw Betty as a tragic figure, a woman driven to commit an unforgivable act because of years of emotional pain. Others, however, viewed her as a villain, a woman who had allowed her anger to overtake her rationality and murder two innocent people in cold blood. But in the courtroom, a much deeper question loomed. Was Betty Broderick a woman who had lost control, or a woman who had taken control of her destiny by any means necessary? In the weeks following the murder, Betty's story became a national sensation. It was a classic tale of betrayal, love, and revenge. But it was also much more. It was a story about how far someone could be pushed before they broke. And as the investigation into the murders continued, the question on everyone's mind was, would Betty Broderick get away with it? The media seized on the case, turning Betty into a household name. They focused on the emotional and psychological toll the years of marriage and divorce had taken on her. The press didn't hold back in portraying her as a woman on the edge, and public opinion swayed in many directions. Betty's lawyers argued that she wasn't just a murderer. She was a victim of years of abuse, manipulated by Dan and abandoned by him at his convenience. But despite this, the most shocking revelation was yet to come. Betty Broderick's trial would become one of the most infamous and controversial in American history. As the story would unfold, the world would realize that the shocking events of that night were only the beginning of a much more complicated and emotional journey. The weeks that followed the brutal murders of Dan and Linda Broderick marked the beginning of a legal battle that would captivate the nation. Betty's trial became a sensational media event, with cameras, journalists, and curious onlookers crowding the courthouse. The case sparked intense debate, and as the legal proceedings unfolded, a dramatic and deeply emotional narrative began to take shape. In the public eye, Betty Broderick became a symbol of a woman scorned, a victim of a failed marriage, and someone who had suffered in silence for far too long. But was she truly a victim? Or had she crossed a line from victimhood to something far darker? As the trial began, Betty's defense attorneys, led by a team of seasoned professionals, painted her as a woman who had been emotionally and psychologically tormented by years of infidelity, manipulation, and emotional abuse. The central claim was that Betty had snapped after years of living under the emotional weight of her broken marriage. Her lawyers argued that her actions were not premeditated, but driven by the intense pressure of betrayal and neglect at the hands of her ex-husband. They called it a crime of passion, something that had been building up over time, culminating in a moment of explosive rage. They argued that Betty, unable to cope with the continuous emotional and psychological toll, had finally lost control. This narrative was not just an attempt to justify her actions, it was an attempt to humanize her, to make the jury see Betty not as a cold-blooded murderer, but as a woman broken by years of injustice. But in contrast, the prosecution argued that Betty's actions were calculated and deliberate. They contended that Betty had not snapped in the heat of the moment, but had instead planned the murders. The details of Betty's movements in the hours leading up to the killings added weight to the prosecution's case. They presented evidence that showed Betty had carefully purchased the doctor's assistant's license and planned to repair the gun after she had made her intend to doctor's assistant's license. They intended to torture her confrontation with Dan and Linda. She had even left notes behind, indicating that she intended to confront her ex-husband about his new life and how he had discarded her. This evidence suggested a level of premeditation, undermining the defense's argument of a crime of passion. As Betty's trial progressed, it was clear that the public was deeply divided. Some saw Betty as a victim of a broken system, a woman who had been mistreated by the very man she had devoted her life to. For them, the emotional pain of watching her family torn apart, coupled with the very real betrayal she felt when Dan moved on with Linda, was enough to explain her actions. Others, however, viewed Betty as a manipulative and dangerous woman who had taken matters into her own hands, exacting a deadly and irreversible form of revenge. What made Betty's case so compelling and so tragic was the fact that there was no easy way to categorize her. Was she a woman driven by love and a desperate desire to salvage what remained of her family? Or was she someone who had allowed jealousy, rage, and bitterness to consume her until she became capable of murder? The media frenzy around Betty Broderick only intensified as the trial continued. Every day, new revelations about her marriage to Dan were brought to light. From their early years together, when Betty was a dedicated housewife, to the painful deterioration of their relationship, every detail was scrutinized. Betty's own testimony added further complexity to the narrative. She expressed a sense of betrayal not just by Dan, but by society as well. The rise of Linda, the other woman, only deepened Betty's feelings of rejection. But Betty also made it clear that her anger was not simply rooted in the emotional hurt caused by infidelity. No, her rage was compounded by the way she had been discarded, the way her role as a wife and mother had been swept aside. But it wasn't just Betty's emotional state that was being put under the microscope. The character of Dan Broderick was also called into question during the trial. He had not been the loving and supportive husband Betty had once believed him to be. Over time, Dan had become more distant, more focused on his career and his new life with Linda. His affair had not only destroyed his marriage, but it had also fractured the family. It was during these years of emotional isolation that Betty began to spiral, her mental health deteriorating with each passing day. Betty's grief was palpable, but was it enough to excuse murder? Or was it simply a story of a woman who had let bitterness and anger control her to the point of no return? The trial was filled with moments that would leave an indelible mark on the public consciousness. There were shocking moments of testimony from Betty herself, recounting her pain and the details of her marriage. But there were also heart-wrenching moments as Dan and Linda's families spoke out. The victims' loved ones painted a picture of a woman who had been deeply hurt but had crossed a line that could never be undone. For them, there could be no forgiveness. As the prosecution and defense battled it out in court, one thing became clear. Betty Broderick's case was not just a legal matter. It was a tragedy, a story of love, loss, betrayal, and a spiral into violence that no one could have predicted. The public followed every twist and turn, eagerly awaiting the outcome of the trial. And as the trial neared its conclusion, one question lingered. How would the jury view Betty? Would they see her as a tragic figure, a woman driven to extremes by a broken marriage? Or would they see her as a calculating killer who had taken matters into her own hands and murdered two innocent people? The verdict was just around the corner, and the world was waiting. Would Betty Broderick be found guilty of murder, or would she be let off the hook by a sympathetic jury? The tragedy of Dan and Linda Broderick's deaths reverberated far beyond the immediate shock of the killings. The world was captivated by Betty Broderick's dramatic fall from a wife scorned to a murderer, and the media seized upon the sensationalism of the case. Headlines painted Betty as a vengeful woman, a jilted spouse consumed by jealousy and rage. Yet in the days and weeks that followed the murders, the narrative became far more complex than the media would ever care to admit. At the heart of it all were the Broderick children. Betty and Dan had 4 children together, 2 sons and 2 daughters. They had once been a family bound together by shared memories of vacations, birthdays, and everyday life. Now, these children found themselves at the center of a nightmare. In the days immediately following the murders, they were forced to confront their broken family in a way no one should ever have to. Betty's children, particularly the 2 daughters, had been at the heart of the family's emotional struggles in the years leading up to the murders. The girls had watched as their mother's mental state began to deteriorate, and as their parents' divorce grew increasingly acrimonious. While they still loved their mother, the deep animosity and pain she harbored toward Dan and Linda became impossible to ignore. The children had to reconcile the woman who had been their mother with the woman now charged with taking lives in cold blood. In the media, Betty was not just the ex-wife of a successful businessman. She was the embodiment of a woman scorned. Some commentators painted her as a victim of the cruel system of divorce, a woman abandoned by her husband for a younger, more vibrant woman. Others saw her as a calculating, vengeful woman who had meticulously planned the murders. But even those closest to Betty could not deny the stark transformation in her personality over the years. The once vibrant social woman who had supported Dan's career ambitions was now a woman whose bitterness seemed to consume her at every turn. Betty's legal team argued that she was not guilty of murder, but had instead acted out of extreme emotional distress, a defense rooted in the emotional turmoil caused by years of infidelity and betrayal. Betty's lawyers painted her as a woman pushed to the edge, unable to cope with the emotional devastation wrought by her ex-husband's behavior. The defense suggested that Betty had snapped, overwhelmed by the years of emotional abuse and neglect. It wasn't the first time this defense had been used in court, but the emotional charges involved seemed to make it especially poignant in this case. But prosecutors, backed by the evidence of her meticulous planning and the chilling nature of the killings, argued otherwise. They painted Betty as someone who had carefully premeditated the murders. The argument of emotional distress could not explain the calculated nature of the crime. She had waited until Dan and Linda were in bed together before shooting them both at point-blank range. The prosecution didn't believe it was a crime of passion, but rather a sort of controlled, methodical act of revenge. The trial, which began in 1991, captivated the nation. Cameras rolled and the drama played out on television screens across America. Betty's every move was dissected, her emotions scrutinized by an audience eager for the latest twist. Despite the overwhelming media coverage, Betty remained resolute in her own defense, maintaining that she had acted out of overwhelming emotional distress. As Betty's trial wore on, the toll on her children became increasingly apparent. They had been thrust into the public spotlight, forced to testify in court, and to reconcile their memories of their father with the image of his murder. The emotional weight was too much to bear. Her children had to witness their mother on trial for taking their father's life. Her sons, particularly, were caught in an emotional tug-of-war. They felt the pain of their mother's deteriorating mental health and the impact of her actions, but they also felt the sting of losing their father, a man who had provided for them, loved them, and ultimately betrayed their mother. The confusion they must have felt is difficult to comprehend. How could someone who had raised them with love and care be capable of something so devastating? Betty's oldest daughter, Kim, struggled the most. She had been a teenager when her parents' divorce became final, and now she was forced to watch as her mother's life unraveled before her eyes. Kim's relationship with her mother became increasingly strained. It seemed that there was no way for Betty to reconcile the intense emotions that had driven her to murder with her role as a mother. Kim and her siblings were left to pick up the pieces, trying to make sense of the devastation their mother had caused. In the end, the public narrative remained fixated on Betty as a villain, a bitter ex-wife driven by jealousy and rage. However, for her children, the situation was far more complex. They were torn between loyalty to their mother, whom they had once adored, and the reality of the crime she had committed. The media and public may have quickly drawn their conclusions, but the emotional aftermath for Betty's family was far from over. As we reflect on Betty Broderick's tumultuous life, it's clear that this case is more than just about a crime. It's about a woman's battle with emotional devastation, jealousy, and betrayal. Her story is filled with raw pain, conflicting emotions, and a desperate sense of hopelessness. In a world where personal turmoil can escalate into violence, Betty's case stands as a tragic reminder of how unchecked mental health issues and fractured relationships can culminate in unimaginable consequences. Betty's life was marked by personal ambition, heartbreak, and a destructive pursuit of revenge. Her actions forever altered the lives of those around her, particularly her children, who became caught in the aftermath of the tragedy. For them, no amount of justice or legal consequence could undo the irreversible damage done on that fateful night. The media's portrayal of Betty, often as a scorned woman seeking revenge, oversimplified her story. The truth is, her crime was a product of years of intense emotional abuse, complex relationships, and a fragile mental state. She may have been a victim of her circumstances, but it doesn't excuse the devastation she left behind. In the end, Betty Broderick's story serves as both a cautionary tale and a lesson on the complexities of human emotions, relationships, and the dangers of unchecked mental distress. It's a haunting reminder of what can happen when love, jealousy, and anger spiral out of control. What are your thoughts on Betty Broderick's case?